many different professions, whether it's technology, legal, healthcare, academics, science, and many, many professions across the global community. So one of the reasons we're doing this is as a founder of another organization called the Corporate Eco Forum. I've been involved in the climate space for over 15 years. And looking at what we're going through today in India, as well as the US and other countries, we thought it would be great to get our global leaders together to really focus on this very specific issue. So we are trying to address all the global time zones. So we have two different sessions. This one addresses the Western Hemisphere. And later today, we have a second session that's meant for the Eastern Hemisphere. So we have a terrific roster of speakers. I'm sure you've looked at the agenda. You've seen we have people from not just the US and India, but from Europe, from Asia, really coming together to address all the key issues here as well. So again, like I said, I do run a second network called the Corporate Eco Forum, which is a membership group of chief sustainability officers of largest companies in the world. And in that context, I got introduced to our opening speaker today, opening keynote, Mark Tercek. Mark really has done and been a champion for climate action for many, many years. He was at Goldman Sachs for 24 years, and he was the first executive at Goldman to really start the environmental initiative at that company. Later, he went on to become the CEO of Nature Conservancy, which is the largest environmental nonprofit in the world. It spans all 50 states here in the US, but also 70 plus countries in the world. He also drove the Capital Fund campaign for TNC. That was a $7 billion campaign to address issues around climate and around conservancy as well. So he's on our advisory board at CEF, but also a friend of India, since Nature Conservancy has a very large office in India as well. So Mark, welcome to the program. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. And everyone, it's really a pleasure for me to be with you today. Back when I was the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, I had the great pleasure of visiting the city of Chennai, India. Just prior to my visit, Chennai had suffered from terrible flooding. Officials called a public meeting to discuss what to do. A local environmental leader and I were invited to moderate a discussion that would be open to everyone in the public. The two of us were asked to start the meeting by offering some ideas on how green infrastructure might address the city's water challenges. And then we were supposed to moderate a group discussion open to all. When they told me the format, I was a bit puzzled. Would this really work, I thought? Could we have a polite and practical exchange of views on such a complicated topic? Would people speak up? Would there be debate? Would there even be questions, I wondered. It turns out there was no reason for me to worry. Right after I was introduced, and before the other moderator even got to say one word, hands shot up and people began expressing their own points of view on how nature might best be deployed to protect people and property from future flooding events. When someone disagreed with another speaker, he or she would speak up and push back. Folks asked questions when an idea wasn't stated clearly. Wow, I thought, this is really great. The audience is well informed. They know that the stakes are high and that action needs to be taken. And they understand that everyone in the community will need to work together and address the challenge in a cooperative way. When I reflect on that experience now, I wonder whether we can globally replicate that practical, cooperative, and determined spirit to get on with taking the necessary action to address the impacts of climate change. We face bigger challenges today than the city of Chennai was facing at the time of my visit. We are dealing with floods, droughts, fires, hurricanes, and heat waves all at once. We all need to develop the passion, interest, and engagement that the residents of Chennai demonstrated during my visit. My topic today is to speak about just that, how to build environmental resilience. and more specifically, how the private sector can lead the way. By resilience, I mean efforts to protect people and property from harm. Resilience is, of course, a global challenge. In my remarks today, I'm going to focus on the US, since that is where I'm now doing most of my work. But I believe my observations apply to all parts of the world. So let's address our main question. What can the private sector do to help build resilience? I believe there are three big opportunities. The private sector can, one, innovate and scale those resilience strategies that also make business sense. Two, lobby for the public policy and programs we need. And three, communicate the importance of resilience efforts and our shared interests. Show that resilience doesn't need to be one more topic that divides and polarizes our communities. Help people see that we really are all in this together. Let's dive in. Let's start with corporate-led climate business strategies. In my view, we should do everything we can to encourage businesses to seize all opportunities related to climate change that will also provide appropriate returns. But we shouldn't kid ourselves and expect companies to do things at scale that don't make business sense. The good news is there are many opportunities to address both resilience and also achieve positive business outcomes. How can this work? Well, resilience initiatives can present new market opportunities that drive top-line growth, or investments that reduce risk, or engagements that rally stakeholders and community members. Let's be more specific and note some clear examples. Reinsurance companies have great risk management and scenario planning expertise connected to climate change. They can make public their analyses of where risk will be greatest. By sharing this information more fully with the public, they can discourage risky behavior, for example, such as immediately rebuilding in coastal areas after hurricanes. Or companies in the agricultural sector can prioritize tools and strategies to produce food in the face of heat waves, water crises, or infestations by pests. Natural resource companies can deploy emerging technologies to improve forest management in order to reduce fire risks. Engineering companies can prioritize heat-resistant metals. Remember how the London Bridge needed to be wrapped in tin foil during one emergency recently in order to avoid melting. Construction companies can develop infrastructure, including nature-based tools, to manage dangerous excess water and excess heat in urban settings, and so on and so on. I also, though, want to emphasize we need to be clear-sighted about the limits of what the private sector can do. To state what I hope is obvious, we should not be counting on the private sector to take on initiatives that don't make business sense. That's not a realistic goal. But sometimes it sounds like that's what some environmentalists are asking businesses to do. Here we can draw some lessons from private sector engagement on climate mitigation. For example, we've seen really great gains in the areas of renewable energy, batteries, and electric vehicles. This is due not only to private sector ingenuity and leadership, it's also due to supportive public policy, including R&D programs, tax incentives, and renewable energy mandates. It's been a great and very encouraging example of climate progress. Lots of actors deserve credit. In addition to business leaders and investors, credit is also due to policymakers, environmental activists, and everyday citizens. The program is mostly working as intended. But even in this area, business leaders really can't go beyond what delivers appropriate returns to their shareholders. Take the recent case of BP, which everybody has read about in the business press recently. More than most oil companies, BP has had a number of very ambitious clean energy goals, which pleased environmentalists like me. But these same programs have disappointed their shareholders. BP's share price lagged rivals like Exxon and Chevron to such a degree that rumors began to circulate that the latter more highly valued companies might attempt a takeover of BP. Before that could happen, BP recalibrated. The company scaled back some of its green initiatives, although they still plan to do more than most of their peers, and their share price as a result rose sharply and immediately. Unlike some critics of BP, I don't see this as a failure by the company. I admire how BP is trying to find its sweet spot, trying to do everything they can to address the climate challenge, while at the same time balancing the need to deliver returns to shareholders. That's the job of a public company, and it's a more, pardon my use of this term, sustainable strategy in the long run. A second example I will note has to do with land use change, the second biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions after fossil fuels. The term land use change is really a euphemism for agriculture. Expanding agriculture, most of which is growing crops to feed livestock, is an enormous threat to the world's great forests and a huge climate challenge. But there's good news from the world of plant-based meat substitutes. New companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Burger and others have innovated in an exemplary way. Their products taste very good, are healthier, and are very superior to meat in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But these meat substitutes do not benefit from supportive government policy, like traditional agriculture and ranching do. So the meat substitutes cost more and therefore are having trouble scaling as quickly as climate advocates should want. If we want this climate tool to grow, we need better policy, public policy, to make that happen. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we turn to climate resilience, yes, we should encourage the private sector to do everything it can to address the challenge. And yes, we should encourage companies to take longer-term views and to accept more risk in exchange for likely higher returns. But we shouldn't expect them to do things that don't make business sense. That's where public policy has to step in. That takes me to my second ask of the private sector. Climate resilience requires thoughtful and ambitious public programs to stave off the harshest outcomes. I have in mind initiatives like building seawalls, relocating people from coastal areas, addressing catastrophic heat waves, attending to likely surges in climate refugees. And remember, the adverse outcomes in these scenarios are not distributed fairly. It will be vulnerable people who bear the most risk. In the event of an extreme heat emergency or a hurricane, for example, it's always elderly and disabled people who can't exit quickly and are therefore most at risk. In these matters, the challenge is not so much identifying what needs to be done, rather it's getting government leaders to take action now. Now is the time to make the investments in infrastructure and public policy we need. Now, the business community has a strong voice, proven government lobbying capabilities, and recognized expertise in making long-term investments to manage risks. Business leaders are therefore well-positioned to step up and be champions for the governmental programs we need. We don't see nearly enough discussion, in my view, about these urgent public policy matters. Business leaders can change that. And let me turn to my third and final ask of business. Please help people understand that on the one hand, none of this is going to be easy, but on the other hand, all of it is in everyone's interest. Investments in resilience are investments in the public good, period. But we know today's divisive political environment has generally not been conducive to large-scale government-led problem solving. Just look at the debate over efforts to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, for example. To mitigate the harshest effects of the climate crisis, people will need to come together, overcome differences, think long-term, and decide on big investments in the face of a lot of scientific uncertainty. To do this, people will need to demonstrate the attitudes and civic-mindedness that I witnessed when I visited Chennai. I think there's reason to be optimistic about this. Adverse climate outcomes usually express themselves locally, and in ways that arouse pragmatic, problem-solving instincts. Confronted by floods, droughts, hurricanes, heat waves, and especially if people are well guided by their leaders, citizens should be more supportive of practical ways to intervene. Business can play a role in clearing the water, so to speak. Demonstrate that we can talk about resilience in calm, inclusive, and respectful ways. This is not about debating science. This is not an argument about bigger or smaller government. Rather, it's about working together on common sense, no regret efforts to protect people and property. Let me wrap up my remarks. I got into the environmental arena as a business person. You heard in my intro, I worked on Wall Street from 1984 to 2008 as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs. My big takeaways from that experience: most of the time, businesses are led by good and honorable people. And most of the time, business succeeds by making the world better. It seemed to me back in 2008, therefore, that business could be a powerful force for good by tackling environmental challenges. So I left Goldman Sachs to become the CEO of the Nature Conservancy. For 11 years, I worked with amazing colleagues and supporters. We did our best to harness the private sector to accelerate progress in protecting nature. And by and large, it worked. Business brings great skills and resources to environmental opportunities. Business knows how to innovate, how to scale, how to move quickly. Business also knows how to communicate and how to get public policy aligned with top priorities. These are just the skill sets we need to address the climate resilience challenge. So let's get to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being with us here today, Mark. I just want to encourage the audience to put any questions that they may have in the Q&A box. One question that I have for you as you were speaking was, what pushback have you received from companies as you were encouraging them to scale some of these business strategies that you mentioned, if any?
Well, I mentioned, I think, today I'm back as an investment banker on a part-time basis. I'm a senior advisor at Centerview Partners, a great strategic M&A firm. And I'm meeting with Fortune 100 CEOs primarily. And I'm talking to them exclusively about environmental matters, how they might do more. And I must say, by and large, all big companies today are pretty good citizens in the environmental arena, if you ask me. I know that not all environmentalists agree with me, but I mostly think they are doing everything they can do that's consistent with running their business well. And business leaders are frustrated sometimes when activists ask them to do things that don't make any sense at all. Business leaders can't really do that. Their job is to produce returns for shareholders, and if they fail to do that, they'll lose their jobs. I think business leaders would like for their investors to be more supportive of environmental programs. Investment firms often say the right thing about this at the headquarters level, but when the actual fund managers enter the fray, they're more focused on near-term business results. And you can tell that. You can read quarterly earnings calls with big companies and their Wall Street analysts and big investors. And there aren't a lot of questions from investors about long-term environmental strategies. So that's a challenge. The other challenge, though, and here I think we need to challenge business leaders, and I mentioned this. Where business gets stuck, they need better public policy to guide and allow them to do more. And I think business leaders can and should push harder for the public policy that we need on these matters.
So in terms of the communication, I mean, are there departments that they can create within the companies?
They're doing all that.
The communication?
I think they're doing all that. To cite a controversial example, I'll mention Exxon, a company that environmentalists really enjoy, it seems, criticizing. And I would acknowledge Exxon's historic track record, especially in communications about climate science, wasn't very good. And who knows, maybe they even will bear some risk in the courts there. That's not my area of expertise. But today, Exxon has a quite ambitious program led by a very able leader. They went outside Exxon to bring in a new executive, Dan Ammon, and they're focused on clean hydrogen, carbon capture, sustainable fuels, And I think there's really every reason to think that a company with Exxon's global reach and engineering skills and science skills really can be a leader in those important areas. There's an interview today on the Axios newsletter, and the leader of this effort, Dan Ammon, explains, these are my words, not his, it's not as easy as it looks to start these new businesses and take them to scale. He acknowledged the Inflation Reduction Act with its incentives for hydrogen and these matters helps a lot. He also acknowledges that there's a need for better policy. So I hope that Exxon's pushing for that. And I hope Exxon shareholders will encourage the company to be as ambitious and as long-term minded as they possibly can be in these areas. And that's what I meant. I mean, I talked about BP in my talk too. These business leaders have to find that sweet spot. We want them to do everything they can, but it's naive and a waste of time, I think, to ask them to do things that won't make business sense, because that just can't be sustainable.
It's definitely a fine line.
Not everybody agrees with me on that, I will acknowledge. And so I always think, and maybe people in this audience disagree, I'd be happy to hear from them. But when we talk about private sector leadership, we need to remember that the private sector is their job is to earn returns. It's not as easy as it looks.
It's definitely a fine line to toe, I guess, in those two industries. Just delving into your background for a little bit. I mean, you were traditionally Goldman Sachs, finance background. What was it about the environment that resonated with you to then make that transition over to the TNC?
It's kind of a long story, but only as an adult did I become very interested in nature and the environment. My wife and I motivated we grew up in cities. I grew up in the city of Cleveland. I wasn't a nature boy at all. But as parents, we wanted to introduce our kids to the world of nature. And then I'm kind of a geek. I read books, and I learned a lot about the workings of nature. And I mentioned that because I think there's likely an inner environmentalist in everyone. You just need to wake up that inner environmentalist. And then at the time I was working as a banker, and as I noted in my speech, I thought then, and I think today, that business is good at innovating, at scaling, and making important things happen. So it seemed to me then, and it seems to me still today, that business can and should be a great champion of achieving environmental progress. But it can't be the only one. We need more ambitious public policy. And so it's where I think some environmentalists go wrong. They're not wrong to criticize business. Of course, there are things to criticize, but simply criticizing business, I don't think unlocks progress. We need also to direct business in the areas we want them to do more. And I think most of the time, an analysis will show we need better public policy. And so then those critics of business, environmental critics of business, should, in my view, be more ambitious and energetic and work harder at getting the public policy we need. I think we all should do that, including the business community.
Well, thank you so much for being with us here today, for giving us your time. We deeply appreciate and admire the work that you do. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll transition over to our next segment. And I'm happy to introduce our Executive Director, Sanjeev Joshipura, who's going to be moderating the fireside chat. So thank you again, Mark. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Neha. That was a great opening segment. I'm now going to proceed to our next item on the agenda, which is a fireside chat. And I'll introduce the accomplished participants in just a second. I'm normally based out of Washington, D.C., but I'm coming to you live today from Charleston, South Carolina, where I am on spring break with my kids and my family. And Charleston, South Carolina has a lot of Civil War history. And that is perhaps an unfortunate segue into what we are about to talk about, because the future of one of the future aspects of climate resiliency, of environmental sustainability, of natural resources in terms of the geopolitics of it, is that we are beginning to see wars over issues pertaining to nature and resources and those kinds of things. And some of them are verbal, sort of metaphorical wars, if you will. Others have been literal wars. And that is really, I think, a sign of the times to come, perhaps in certain areas of the world. I know that there are very good people in business and policy and international diplomacy working to avoid just these issues, and indeed in the nonprofit space. That's what our next segment will focus on the geopolitics of energy. And let me introduce the two participants in the fireside chat. We have with us Varun Sivaram. Dr. Sivaram is a physicist, a best-selling author, a clean energy technology expert. He has experience in the corporate, public policy, and academic sectors. He serves as the Group Senior Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at Burston. And previously in the Biden-Harris administration, he was the Managing Director for Clean Energy and Innovation under Secretary John Kerry. He has served as well as the Chief Technology Officer at India's largest renewable energy company, Renew Power, and has been on the faculty at Columbia and Georgetown Universities, was the Director of the Energy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the author of 3 books and was listed in the Time 100 Next list. Varun, welcome to the show. We also have Suriya Evans Pritchard Jayanti, and Suriya is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's the co-founder and MD, the managing director of NA, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a US-Ukrainian decarbonization company. She's an award-winning US international energy legal and policy expert. Her specific expertise is on Eastern Europe, and her overall focus is on the geopolitics of energy and strategic energy policy. She is based in Washington, D.C., and has served the US diplomatic corps for a decade in Kuwait, the Bahamas, Iraq, Ukraine, and indeed in Washington. She has been an energy attorney in Brussels and in Washington, D.C., and a journalist at the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut, Lebanon. She also currently serves as the Energy Transition Counsel at the US Department of Commerce. Welcome, Suri.
Thank you so much.
Delighted to have both of you here on the program today. Couldn't think of 2 better people to talk about what we are going to discuss now, the geopolitics of energy. There are a few things I want to get to as part of this segment. I'm sure that you will have your own thoughts and ideas that you want to contribute and sort of initiate as well, which we would welcome. Let me get started with one thing that I'll take away from the last COP, the COP27. There was a fund that was established, the Loss and Damage Fund, to help the global South, as one might call it, deal with the ravages of climate change. And one has heard over time of sort of the increasing discrepancy of opinions in some areas. In some areas, there are indeed converging opinions where a lot of work is being done by developing countries in the areas of climate change, various areas of climate change. India comes to mind as one example of a country that is doing a lot in the climate change area. But there are also areas of discrepancy and disagreement about how the Western world for a long time got to its economic prosperity without thinking of climate change, and now wants to tell the developing world how they should sacrifice in order sort of for the greater good in the climate space. What are your perspectives, both of you, in terms of the North-South divide or the convergence in the areas of climate change and resilience?
Well,
Varun,
I
I'll
think
go to you first, and then, or Suriya, you want to take a stab at this? Suriya, go ahead.
I was just waiting for him to unmute himself because I think he should start too.
Sure, happy to. All right, we're starting with the big topics here. Look, my sort of provocative position on this is we're kind of missing the point. You can absolutely debate until the end of time whose fault climate change is, who bears most of the burden. I actually think many of these answers are pretty straightforward. It is in fact the case that the currently wealthy countries bear the brunt of the historical emissions that have led to where we are today. And I include China in that picture, along with the United States, Europe, et cetera. But going forward, energy demand is fastest growing in emerging economies, particularly in Asia. And at the end of the day, rather than haggling over who is going to pay what historical cost or reparation, the clean energy transition is already up and running. Often the sums we talk about in these allocation decisions are pretty small sums of money, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars here or there. Last year, the energy transition clocked over $1 trillion already. largely driven by private investments in solar, wind, electric vehicles. So it is up and running. India is, as you mentioned, Sanjeev, India is already a leader in the clean energy transition. It's the leading emerging economy. And India is in the world's top 3 solar and wind markets routinely nowadays. So the correct set of questions is probably, how do we continue to turbocharge the clean energy transition? It's at $1 trillion today. We're going to require trillions of dollars annually going forward. Rather than haggle over what reparations fund is created here and, et cetera, et cetera. Those questions tend to be debated by diplomats, but have no true importance in the actual clean energy transition that's unfolding in front of us. And love to talk about the real geopolitical implications of what's happening as we move from a world dominated by fossil fuels to one increasingly that will have clean electricity and clean fuels. There will be geopolitical effects of the transition and geopolitical effects of the end state. And they happen to be very different implications. So happy to dive into both of those.
Couldn't agree more. We'll also agree that as a diplomat, most of what we argue about is a waste of time, because while we are arguing, things could be getting done. And so I very much agree that taking a pragmatic approach to this is going to be extremely important. What the energy transition that has been spurred on most recently, of course, by the Russian invasion in Ukraine and the ensuing energy crisis has done is so dramatically upend global power balances, specifically in energy and commodities, that there is an unusual opening right now for a lot of countries that have traditionally viewed themselves as victims in the climate change fallout to really take the lead. So, for example, I am currently in Belgrade, Serbia, not a country one thinks of as potentially being at the forefront of the energy transition. In fact, much like Poland, it tends to be a punching bag for more climate conscious Western countries. But the fact of the matter is that Serbia has as much as 10% of the world's global lithium reserves. And so a country like Serbia is now looking at the possibility of really taking a big step forward into global climate change and global energy transition supply chains. And that provides an amazing opportunity for a lot of the traditional climate balances of power to readjust. And there are quite a few regions in the world where this is happening. Central Asia, for example, has been given a huge opportunity to fill some of the supply chain gaps that have been created by Russia's invasion and the sanctions that are now on most Russian energy supplies. And so you have countries like Kazakhstan that for the first time are really beginning to step up and take a leading role in the energy transition. I do also think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the same countries, the loudest about being the victims of climate change, also then use it to continue perpetuating their use of legacy fossil fuels. And so you take a country like India. India is absolutely on the forefront of the energy transition and is simultaneously increasing its imports of crude oil and is increasing its burning of fossil fuels and coal, for example. So a lot of the countries that could most easily and most quickly really assume leadership roles in an absolute as well as a relative sense are holding themselves back to some degree by maintaining the complaint that they are still developing countries who must get reparations, when in fact there are both public and private sector opportunities will pay for the transition itself and could catapult them into being geostrategic superpowers, at least in the energy sphere.
Can I pick up on one point that I'm sure is on the minds of many that Suriya mentioned, the crisis in Ukraine right now? I know that you have done a lot of work, Suriya, on Eastern Europe. And Varun, I'm almost certain that in your time with John Kerry and otherwise, as part of the geopolitical angle, the Russia issue was probably discussed on numerous occasions. I can see a wry smile, I think, a good diplomat smile, not giving anything away. But the question I have really is in regards to things like Nord Stream, and I'll get to my broader point. Nord Stream, I mean, one has seen, for example, in Europe, in the past, Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, he's now on the board of Gazprom and, on the Nord Stream board, and then later on Angela Merkel, and now even Olaf Scholz in Germany, have taken on the energy issue, perhaps a somewhat softer line on Russia than other countries, NATO allies, America specifically, would have liked. On other issues, they have taken a harder stance, but on the energy issue specifically, for perhaps their own needs, they've taken a softer line on Russia than what might have been hoped for. Now, while it's understood that Western Europe needs the energy supplies from Russia, isn't it also fair to say that Russia needs the customers, not just in Western Europe, but also elsewhere in the world? And that's where I want to bring in India, because Suriya, you had mentioned about how India continues to be an importer of energy from Russia. And of course, India justifies this based on the needs of their populace, the growing demands for energy and so forth. But the real question I have is, in this sort of delicate diplomatic dance, is there something constructive and creative that can be done that protects the interests and the needs of the consumers of energy, and yet somewhat divorces the supplier, in this case, Russia? Or is it sort of a dance that we are doomed to kind of coexist in for the, to the detriment of everybody in the short term, because there are no alternative options?
Well, I'm happy to take a stab. Love to hear Suriya's thoughts on this. And I actually thought, Suriya, your answer on the last question was just perfectly articulated. I couldn't agree more. Look, the Russia situation has clearly demonstrated to us that a continued dependence on unreliable, autocratic fossil fuel producers is an untenable situation. At Ørsted, my current company, Ørsted is one of the world's largest renewable producers, biggest producer of offshore wind, actually. It's turbocharged the business case. Renewable energy, particularly high capacity factor renewable energy from offshore wind, is more needed than ever, particularly in Europe. Now, Sanjeev, you made the point that historically there's kind of been a divergence in how hard a time countries will give Russia on a set of issues that are not energy, and then have a divergence in energy. I think fortunately we've now seen a convergence in how countries in Europe will treat Russia, whether it's on energy or not on energy. Europe is accomplishing a remarkable reduction in their dependence on Russian energy. This includes not only oil, which has been largely cut off, but also increasingly LNG and pipeline gas, which historically, we thought was close to impossible. But Europe has acted very quickly. And while I was in the Biden administration, I was proud to work with colleagues where we, very quickly worked with Europe to demonstrate American solidarity and make sure that we could export energy and export clean technology, cooperation, and products to Europe. Going forward, what do we see here? I'll also say, to your point on India, I actually think the price cap is working quite well. This was a sort of ingenious mechanism devised by, where Secretary Yellen, for example, along with our European partners, we're now limiting the revenue that Russia can make from its the levies it imposes on oil revenues, on oil exports, while at the same time enabling a country like India to continue to purchase oil, often at a low price. So sort of everybody wins except for Russia. And if you look at this from Putin's perspective, look, nobody can get inside that guy's head. But I will say this is the biggest own goal you can imagine. Putin, who had a strong geopolitical hand, an extraordinary energy position, has suddenly cut himself off from most of his most lucrative customers and tied himself up now with, just a handful of remaining consumers, and is more dependent than ever on China, both for oil exports and for a range of imports. So this, from a rational economic analysis point of view, this couldn't have been a more irrational move by Vladimir Putin. Going forward, what happens now? Look, we've demonstrated that in Europe, energy security is helped kind of principally by increasing share of clean energy. And this will be true around the world. What will that mean, though? Well, one consequence will be that energy markets will become increasingly regionalized. As we move toward electricity and fuels that depend on clean sources like renewable wind and solar, You'll get your energy not often from a global market, but from a regional electricity market. That means that your geopolitics of energy become much more regionalized. It means that while you reduce certain risks, let's say you reduce the risk of a supply shutoff from an unreliable dictatorial country, you also increase certain other risks. You increase, for example, the risk of a cyber attack on your smart grid infrastructure because you are more reliant on a new clean source of electricity. My point is just that the ramp down of certain risks and the ramp up of certain risks isn't entirely asymmetric. That sure, we will certainly reduce risks induced by volatile fossil fuel prices and autocratic dictators, but we'll also have to contend with new risks. In the meantime, there's a third risk called supply-demand imbalances, that as you start to ramp down the supply of fossil fuels and ramp up clean energy, in the medium term or in the near term, prices can kind of go haywire. We saw prices go haywire for electricity, for gas, for oil during the Ukraine invasion. And this can happen over the next 10, 20 years as we do the clean energy transition. So that's also something we'll have to monitor and make sure that consumers can be shielded from some of the volatility of making this transition.
I certainly won't repeat the Russia part because I agree completely. And so rather than say it my way, I will just 2 thumbs up. 2 thumbs down on Russia, 2 thumbs up on what Varun just said about it. But I do think that it's important to talk about the fact that the energy crisis isn't over. And I think last year, well, in 2021, the world began to notice that energy was important. It became a household topic of conversation as natural gas and oil prices spiked, principally natural gas, and electricity consequently spiked with it. And then the invasion obviously turbocharged that and sent prices to crazy record highs, principally in Europe, but by no means exclusively in Europe. And we are seeing the inflationary fallout everywhere. But it's not actually quite over. And although Europe got incredibly lucky this winter, that is a super double-edged sword because the same climate change consequences that allowed Europe to not burn down, consume its existing natural gas storages will also make this summer very difficult. And if we look back at last summer, there were massive droughts in quite a lot of different parts of the world, much of Europe, China, etc. There were also forest fires that took over huge swaths of land on multiple continents. And what that did was spike electricity prices again. And so a lot of what we need to consider is not so much whether we're getting the natural gas from Russia, because to some extent, certain fossil fuels are fungible. Natural gas, much less so, because either it's moved as liquefied natural gas or it's moved through the pipeline. And what Russia has done is essentially cut off its pipeline access. Well, the access is still there, but Russia's not using it, and nor would Europe receive it absent a cataclysmic crisis. And there isn't comparable pipeline access into China, nor has China been quick to agree to more pipelines being built directly to Russia. Nonetheless, I think one of the things we really need to think about is the power sector fallout from all of this, because really, natural gas is most important as a power sector input. And one of the ways that we can most quickly move away from dependence on both fossil fuels, but also on malign actors like Russia who use energy as leverage against other countries, or in the case of Europe, continents, is to find alternative power sources, because increasingly electrification will allow us to do that. And of course, offshore wind, important. Heat pumps in the cold northern hemisphere, also very important. But we do need to be able to generate that electricity. Nuclear is probably the only scalable power source that will allow us to continue our current level of growth and industrialization and our current consumption levels without for example, going back and taking Russian fossil fuels or Chinese fossil fuels that happen to actually come from Russia, but then get rerouted. Right. Again, these markets are somewhat fungible. Unfortunately, nuclear, despite all of the hype about a renaissance of nuclear, and there is one, is very constrained by regulatory regimes. And the United States in particular, for example, has what it considers to be, and I quote, the gold standard of nuclear regulation. Well, that's fine, except the gold standard of nuclear regulation is essentially an abstinence-only approach to nuclear, because no nuclear has been built in the United States in 45 years. And so there are quite a lot of areas in which governments are still going to play a big role. And so, although I fully agree with all of the discussion we've had about the importance of the private sector, given the fact that the energy crisis will continue to be ongoing, there does need to be a government role in liberalizing or supporting the private sector to accelerate the replacement of those fossil fuels, especially from Russia and other traditional energy sources that got us into this mess in the first place. And there are ways to do that. The Inflation Reduction Act is a very good example of that. Yes, it's controversial in Europe, but it's controversial in Europe because Europe wishes it had one. And so the best approach to do this at this point is for everybody to do it. And that means that although there will be stragglers, you can get into the discussion, for example, about who should get reparations once they've made some affirmative steps forward that bring the whole world with it. So this will continue. There will be a great deal of market upheaval. We will continue to have power shortages in a lot of the world. We will continue to have inflation. We will have price spikes. But again, we already know what we need to do to fix this. And we've already done a lot of it. We now just need to do more of it. And we need to go back 5 years and do more of it 5 years ago. But in the meantime, people like us are busily working to try to push this forward, recognizing that it is a transition. And it would be great if we could snap our fingers and wake up tomorrow and have the entire world be solar, but that's not going to happen. So how can we manage this transition as well as possible, considering that you have parties like Russia that suddenly decide to throw, I mean, wrench doesn't even begin to talk about it, but try to throw everything they possibly can into the gears to shut it down. I realize I'm meandering a little bit there, but that's my take on where Russia leaves us.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Suriya and Varun. Fascinating answers. One last quick fire question, if you will, from one of our Indiaspora members in Switzerland, Julian Sitaramdu, who is watching and has contributed his question via chat. And I'll give both of you a minute each to respond to this one. Says Julian, in Europe, companies and local governments were able to reduce gas usage by 5 to 10% by simple things such as switching off lights in public buildings at night and turning down the thermostat by 1 or 2 degrees in public buildings. So is it fair to say that there is considerable low-hanging fruit that is still left to be captured by simple energy conservation measures?
Look, it's a great question. I now work at a Danish headquartered company, and so I go to Denmark every couple of weeks. And in the winter, let me tell you, the office is freezing. It's like really cold. And so I can tell you that in fact, a lot of this low-hanging fruit has been harvested. Suriya made the great point on heat pumps. And that is an excellent way for Europe to reduce kind of the 1/3 of its dependence on Russian pipeline gas through replacing through investing in heat pumps. So of course, I think energy efficiency is important, but I do want to commend European countries for taking advantage of energy efficiency. You could probably have done more, right? Price caps on natural gas, for example, don't help you to send the correct price signal for energy efficiency measures. But nevertheless, I think it's a great point. I'll also, without actually answering it, I'll commend the next question by Sarjeev. It's actually an excellent question. Maybe we save this for another discussion, but this idea of we have these interrelated supply chains and some bottlenecks coming up. How do we make sure that we have going from a oil and gas dominated world to a renewables, and I agree with Suriya, nuclear dominated world? How do we make sure that countries have robust and diverse sources of supply going forward. My hypothesis, by the way, is it's far less of a national security risk to have your solar panels dependent on one country than it was to have your oil dependent on a few countries, because you're not going to have lines at gas stations if tomorrow a particular large country decides to shut off the supply of solar panels. It will probably only hurt that country, not the receiving country. But that's just my early hypothesis. Over to you, Suriya.
Certainly can't agree. Can't disagree in any way. Couldn't agree more. I think, yes, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has, well, it's not so much that it's been plucked, it's that we've worked out which trees we should be planting. And I think that there is plenty of room for growth, and there is plenty of room for scaling a lot of what we have now identified as the correct solutions up to meet the necessary demand. The fact of the matter is there does probably need to be some belt tightening, and nobody likes to talk about reducing consumption. Nobody likes to talk about the demand side of this. But if you look at what's happened in Europe, Europe has managed to cut consumption by about 20%, but unfortunately only about 5% of that are actual sort of individual consumption reductions. The rest thus far has mostly been from factories and businesses shuttering themselves for one day a week, for example, or closing entirely because the costs of heating the building and powering the building got so high in 2022 that it was no longer economical for those companies to continue operating. And yet we know that if we turn off or maybe dim the streetlights and bring government buildings and public buildings down to 70 degrees, for example, and in America, oh my goodness, can we please stop air conditioning everything to -40 the entire year round, right? Then there is still plenty of room, and those little marginal gains do add up. They really do. But then there are the obvious supply chain issues. And one, as mentioned, is nuclear. We really need to get building some nuclear, and we need it to not be China and Russia. And right now they are. They're the only ones doing it. Everyone else is talking about it, but everyone else is stuck in risk management and risk aversion issues, a difficulty attracting financing because of the risk profile of nuclear, which, to be perfectly honest, is not, it's a fear that is based on prior technologies, not on the emerging technological profiles of nuclear. And then there are all of the supply chain commodity issues, the minerals that you need, the metals that you need for solar panels to build wind turbines. Nuclear, is the best example, are also things we ought to have invested a bit more in 5 or 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean it's too late now. We are finding new mineral discoveries and mineral deposits all over the world. We can get nickel up and running. We can find more uranium in, for example, Nigeria. But there is the same opposition to mining that we often see, the sort of NIMBYism to a lot of other potential solutions. And the fact of the matter is that every single source of energy has some form of drawback. Wind turbines are great, except they're out there and some people find them ugly and birds run into them, and we're reliant on China for what we need to produce them. Solar panels are fantastic, except, well, we have to manufacture them, and it requires minerals that for the most part are increasingly hard to find and are from countries where there are problems, and China has a monopoly on it. Fine. Nuclear, everybody's scared of, and oh, by the way, Russia has 42% of nuclear enrichment capacity. Well, shucks. So, and then oil and gas is obviously something we have to transition out of. So we really do need to accept as a society and as a global society, but there can be variations on a national level or even a regional level where we're willing to make those compromises. And maybe we reduce consumption a little bit, great. Maybe we decide that we're okay with whatever the downsides of one power or energy source is in favor of another. And there will be differences from country to country. Some countries are pro-nuclear, some countries are not. Some countries really care about their beachfront views and do not want offshore wind. Okay, fine. Well, they can have solar panels. They can have geothermal. There are options, but I think we as a society need to start having the conversation about what we're willing to compromise on, because we actually can't have it all. There will be a downside to every course that we take, but in every single possible solution, there is still room to move the issue and to advance the cause.
This has been an incredibly fascinating discussion, Suriya and Varun. I'm currently on vacation, like I was saying, in Charleston, South Carolina, and this may not be everybody's idea of a vacation, but for my next vacation, my wish list would be to have breakfast, lunch, coffee, and dinner with both of you, and just sit and listen to you all day long discussing the geopolitics of energy. This
Well,
has
I
been
think all three of us,
fun.
we're all three in DC, so pick a day.
No, this has been fascinating.
Maybe none of us is in DC right now because the climate change issues are global. And so the other thing we really need to do is keep building practical, pragmatic relationships, not just the geostrategic partnerships, but the business to business relationships that are really going to get this done. And so I think it is an accurate reflection of the state of affairs that we are all gathered here, scattered very much around the world.
Absolutely. Hey, and just want to add a thanks to MR and Sanjeev and Amita and everybody else. You guys have done a great job creating Indiaspora. I will just say, I love seeing the number of folks who could be in Indiaspora working on global climate issues in the White House, in private industry. It is really inspiring. So hope we can do this more often. Thanks. Absolutely.
We'll make climate one of our focal points as we are expanding globally. We are finding a lot of receptivity to our work on climate. So thank you. Couldn't think of two better leading examples among the diaspora than Varun and Suriya, like I said at the outset, to be talking about this. Thank you both for an excellent fireside chat. And I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Shobha Vishwanathan, who is in New York, just outside of New York City. And she will introduce our next segment. She's our Director of Community Relations. Shobha, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. What a fascinating conversation. From that point of the role of private sector in climate change issues, tackling climate change issues, to the global perspective on energy transition, we now move to a panel. And these panelists will be talking about India's green growth opportunity, how to realize the vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat. It's my pleasure to introduce this 5-person panel. I'll start off with Dr. Amul Phadke, who is a staff scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and an affiliate and senior scientist at the Goldman School of Public Policy at University of California, Berkeley. Amol is published widely and he regularly advises the national government, utilities, and regulators in India on energy policies and programs. We have had the pleasure of having Dr. Phadke with us at a session in San Jose late last year. It was such a great conversation on energy, and we are looking forward to a similar conversation today. Our next panelist is Kiran Bhatraju. He is an entrepreneur and environmentalist who grew up in Eastern Kentucky, coal country. Kiran is the founder and CEO of Arcadia, a climate crisis fighting technology company focused on unlocking unprecedented access to clean energy options for consumers and businesses across the US. Previously, Kiran founded another venture-backed climate tech company, American Efficient, that aggregated energy efficiency in wholesale power markets. Kiran serves on the board of App Harvest and also with World Wildlife Fund National Council. Welcome, Kiran. Our next panelist is Rudra Dalmia, who is a managing partner and with Green Frontier Capital. Rudra is the managing partner at, Rudra is a managing partner of Green Frontier Capital, India's first ever climate tech fund. GFC invests in early stage companies which are focused on delivering breakthrough innovation in green frontier industries, such as electric mobility, food tech, ag tech, renewable energy, biofuels, waste management, clean water, and more. Prior to this, Rudra has successfully built and turned around high growth businesses across sectors, including fintech and e-commerce. Rudra is also an active angel investor in the United States and in India. And we also know him well. Rudra is an Indiaspora member, and he helped us connect with Kushi, an NGO who is India's preeminent private educational charity with over 45,000 beneficiaries across India. Welcome, Rudra. And I should also mention that this panel has representatives from across the world. And the next person I introduce is joining us from Germany. Sushant Palakruti Rao is the Managing Director of Global External Relations at Agility, a global leader and investor in supply chain services and innovation. In this capacity, Sushant oversees group public affairs and supports the Agility board and the CEOs of its subsidiary companies in their business development, strategic initiatives, and partnership development. There was reference in the earlier fireside chat to the implications of supply chain challenges in the energy transition. And I think Sushant brings special perspective to this aspect of the conversation, and we look forward to hearing from him. And finally, I introduce Shruti Diora, who will be moderating this panel. She is the director of the newly established India Energy and Climate Center at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and an affiliate scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She conducts research on policy and regulatory issues in decarbonization of power sector in India. Her focus areas include regulatory aspects of grid integration of renewables, storage and its impact on resource planning, and market design for the evolving sector. We are so happy to have all of you here, and there are much longer details in the bio, and I'm leaving it to our guests to read about it in the chat that has also been shared by our team. And we'd love to see, love to get your perspective on where you think India's green growth opportunity lies. Thank you all for being here. Shruti, please take over the conversation.
So namaskar and a very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, okay. So thank you for joining us for this summit. And of course, thank you to our previous panel for such an enriching discussion. I think we all are here because climate change is the biggest challenge faced by humanity ever. And we see impacts of climate change all around us. From heat waves in India to snow-capped peaks in the Bay Area, I think it's high time that we all are here discussing this important topic. So I think even though it can be very scary and depressing, today's panel is all about optimism. The optimism that we feel that we are at this cusp of a major transformation, a major global transformation, and how we can catapult India to be a global leader in this process. So let me start with 3 facts. So first, India imports 90% of its oil and 80% of industrial coal. Second, India's energy demand has tripled over the last 3 decades and is expected to quadruple over the next 3 decades. And third, India has seen some of the lowest energy prices, renewable energy prices in the world globally, and that prices of lithium-ion battery technologies have dropped by about 90% over the past decade. So what this means, when we put all these 3 things together, what we are stating at is a massive leapfrog opportunity for India, an opportunity to devise a novel development model, a model that is based on clean and green energy and not on coal and oil. And some of our previous panelists mentioned that. So at the newest study that we have released at, that was conducted at Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley, what we find that Prime Minister Modi's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat by 2047, or an energy independent India to mark 100 years of India's independence, is actually possible through clean technologies. And that is possible while saving trillions of dollars for consumers and preventing millions of dollars in millions of premature deaths due to air pollution. Second, improving industrial competitiveness of India's auto and steel industries. Third, all the lithium that India might need for such an ambitious transition is actually discovered recently in Jammu and Kashmir, and our study assesses that. And fourth, last but not the least, this would enable India to reduce its carbon emissions from all the energy sectors to near zero by mid-century, about 20 years ahead of India's commitment at COP, which was a 2070 net zero commitment. And so how do we make this happen, right? India's green growth opportunity seems to be deeply linked with the ambition for India to become a $20 trillion economy. So let me turn over to our panel of experts, let me start with Amol. So Amol, could you talk to us a little bit about what it would take for India to achieve energy independence? What are the technologies, what enabling policies, and what kind of growth opportunities such a pathway offers for an industry?
Thanks, Shruti. I'm going to just jump right in. I really appreciated Mark's opening remarks of the interplay between policy and technology. So I feel that India has to advance some very concrete public policy to create markets for clean technology. And I want to give you kind of 3 specific examples to make it a bit real. So India imports about $100 billion worth of oil every year, Where is that oil going? Most of this oil is going into transportation. What kind of transportation? So a lot of the oil, more than 60% of the oil used for transport in India is in buses and trucks, not two-wheelers and three-wheelers. And recent dramatic declines in technology has created a massive opportunity for electrification of buses and trucks. Now, with the right public policy, this becomes also an economical opportunity because inherently buses and electric buses and trucks deployed at scale are incredibly more efficient and also have lower total economic costs. So it's in a concrete example where India can really take leapfrog into, say, electric buses and trucks, improve electrification of rail, or massively expand rail. If India doesn't do that, it also faces a massive risk in a sense that there is significant amount of employment in the automotive sector. So if there are major competitors who are making electric trucks and buses outside India and selling it, because inherently the technology is superior, India could lose massive amounts of auto sector employment. So there is a massive opportunity and massive risk. So what is the private sector supposed to do on this is, again, going back to the formulation of it really has to support good public policy on infrastructure and requirements on deployment of electric vehicles, but also make strategic investment in those sectors. So that's one example. The other major growth opportunity, India is one of, say, largest producers and consumers of steel. Now, India has a unique opportunity. India is projecting to kind of increase its steel producing capacity 3 times in the next 20 years. Now, if it goes the fossil route, yes, it may be the kind of the economical option at this point, but then it faces huge risk because you see increasing kind of border adjustment tariffs that will make fossil steel non-competitive. India does have the opportunity to leapfrog to green steel competitively, but again, a combination of kind of public policy and private sector decisions are required. And lastly, I don't want to kind of ignore, there was a lot of discussion on kind of what we could do on the demand side. Just to give you an example of scale, that our projection says that India's cooling demand from air conditioners is going to increase massively because of course, climate change, but also because of increasing incomes. Just to give you folks a scale estimate, the projected demand from air conditioners in India by 2030 is 3 times the scale of just California's grid, just air conditioners in India. There are air conditioners available in the marketplace, which are 2 to 3 times more efficient than the average air conditioner sold in India. So there is a massive opportunity for kind of public policy and private sector to act together. So if this is done, a coordinated approach from public policy and private sector, we are talking about at least $500 billion of kind of high IRR investments possible in the energy sector in the next 7 to 10 years.
Thank you, Amol. Thank you. I will now turn to Rudra. So Rudra, you invest in early stage clean tech companies in India. So how have you seen the industry evolve over the last few years? And so what is Government of India doing to spur clean tech innovation, and how can it be scaled up further? Sorry, you're on mute.
Hi, Shruti. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So Shruti, we are an early stage venture capital company, which identified this sector, as Amol said, full of opportunities and full of risks. And 3 years on from our investment sort of journey when we started, we put our investments in 2 buckets. One is the innovation that radically changes, how we do things. For example, things like battery technology improvement or cultured fermentation, making synthetic meats, lab-grown meats, lab-grown cheese, lab-grown, etc. And then the other bucket is how you innovate in changing user behavior of solutions that already exist. So things like indoor farming, solar energy, which has now become mainstream, which was 10 years ago in the earlier bucket, which I mentioned, and financing targeted towards greener solutions, which is something that is a massive opportunity and as Amol said, a massive problem in India because financing is very, very expensive. And things like ethanol, which is now becoming mainstream because of the government policy. Our biggest challenge, the way I see India's venture capital and this private sector support to climate change, is actually not going to be in the catalytic earlier stages of innovation. It's going to be in the scaling up stages. India does not have long-term capital with long tenure and low-cost bonds available to fund an entire, and we keep, the numbers I hear are trillions of dollars, $1 trillion, $2 trillion. These numbers, and people are just pulling these numbers out of their own estimates of things that need to be transformed. It's not going to happen so easily. So the government policies take many years. For example, the solar mission, I think, was started in 2010. It became viable in 2020. The National Hydrogen Mission has started. We are running out, unfortunately, in climate, we are running out of time. So unless and until, so we will provide the funds like us. There are several now, and I've met over 350 companies in India. We made 12 investments. There's no shortage of innovation. There's no shortage of early stage capital. The challenge is going to come in the growth capital. As Amol said, the strategic capital is there. The smart entrepreneurs of India have realized, the big industrialists have realized that transforming the way they do things, for example, especially in sectors like auto, they're already attracting capital. They have the supply chains, they have the brands, they'll get to the market. But in food tech, people don't talk enough about food changes in agricultural techniques. India is largely agrarian. We keep talking about energy. We keep talking about pollution caused by fossil fuels. There is very little targeted private investment. And yes, the government is aware of it. But for a large machine like the government to mobilize its capital and resources towards catalyzing the way farmers do business or farmers do things in India, especially in things like milk and meat, it's very, very difficult for a government to come out with a policy which is short term, which will lose them the next election. That's why when the world talks about innovation, when the world talks about the global south and the global north, in addition to the capital that I just mentioned, long-term capital that is required to grow and sort of create the large-scale impact that we need desperately as of yesterday, India can't do it with domestic capital or government support. We need catalytic capital coming from the West, and I don't see that happening. Right now with the war going on, so I think the last year has been horrible for all the things we wanted to do and all the things we imagined 2 years ago in climate change, in terms of attracting capital. Everywhere we go, we have, some of our companies are the best at what they do. Everybody's telling the guys, slow down. There's no capital available for the next round. So these are massive challenges. And I think the government is doing a lot, but a lot more needs to be done. And, we can keep talking about it, but, I cede the floor back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I think another challenge here is that, India has, for example, come out with the production-linked incentive to encourage domestic manufacturing of solar panels and lithium batteries. But the scale of that is about $10 billion. And compare it to US IRA, where the scale is officially $360 billion, but our estimate says it's over $1 trillion in subsidies that US government will hand out to to US businesses. So I think as you rightly say, that I think that gap in financing, and our study shows we'll need about $3 to $4 trillion of investment through through 2050. That gap in financing has to be met by private capital, and India will need to tap into the global capital. And I'm hoping Varun is still here. If not, but I'm very glad to hear that $1 trillion are already coming per year, and hoping India can attract a lot of that. So thank you. And let me move on to our next question, which is for Kiran. So Kiran, I think a lot of studies, and we also believe this, that a clean power grid would play a central role in the green economy of the future. And your company, Arcadia, it works with thousands of utilities globally. So what business opportunities and challenges do you see for countries like India and US to move to a renewables first or a heavy clean grid?
Yeah, maybe piggybacking on the last question too. I think what is maybe not as well understood about the IRA is it's effectively leveraging corporate tax profits to be reinvested into clean energy technology. So there was a study that recently was if we fully fund sort of what we believe will be the investments through the IRA in things like heat pumps and in the distribution grid and community solar, rooftop solar, storage, et cetera. It's going to be almost a third of corporate profits that are going to effectively be invested so these corporations can take tax credits. And I actually think that's the brilliance of the IRA is it's, if you think about US sort of, our own clean tech fits and starts over the last 2 decades, it was all pushed by corporates. The government created a wind tax credit for production, an investment tax credit for solar, and we just put that on steroids. And you asked the question in the US and India, like how do we upgrade a grid? It does run through these centralized utilities, and as we all know, they're structured as sort of quasi public-private monopolies. They're not the first ones that are going to take the first step to change how they operate. And so what's amazing about the IRA and what I think India could do, to your point, I mean, you just mentioned, Shruti, how low the sort of investment is to the problem in India, is engage corporates who basically want tax breaks to take those dollars and invest them in grid upgrades and products. I think that's like the amazing thing that we actually accomplished through the IRA that can get, I think a lot of carbon and decarbonization policies, especially in Europe, are more penalty-based. And here it's more of a business opportunity, right? If you're a corporation sitting on profits, trust me, every CFO in America is thinking about, well, I'm going to put some of that money into these clean energy projects to not only get a return, but also save on my taxes. That's effectively what the IRA is structured. And so that is like a very easy policy to take over to India to say, it's hard to reform your utility sector for a whole bunch of reasons, but if you can engage the private sector to make these investments, that is a really strong path.
Thanks, Kiran. I just wanted to check if Amol wanted to just, say anything about the policy angle here before I come to Sushant.
No, I agree 100%. In fact, that, so basically having a not exactly similar, but essentially incentive-based policy that changes the calculus for the private sector is the only pathway I see in India to get to this, because it will then also partially address the financing question. Because if the investments are then profitable even with the significant risk, that is what IRA is doing. Like, it has such massive incentives that yes, you can take a bit of risk, but even with those risks and fluctuations, the investments are profitable. That will attract capital. Now, people will say, well, India, that does not have that scale of money to really match what the US is doing. That being said, though, the cost of production are so lower in India. So, for example, if you look at the cost of manufacturing of solar panels or electrolyzers, if those are 1/3, then the nudge you may need to give with incentives is also likely to be lower. The other interesting fact is that US has incredibly cheap energy, fossil energy. US has an abundant supply of natural gas. So the amount of push from incentives the US needs to give to flip the calculus for the private sector is far greater than what India would need to flip, because India is importing LNG at $10, $20 per MMBTU, where US domestic natural gas price is sub $3. So US needs to pump in a lot of money to transform. So I completely agree that in addition to kind of penalty/mandatory based policies, which the industry will lobby hard against, it is a real time to kind of explore a pared down version of IRA in India. Also sell it as a competitiveness strategy. One of the reasons IRA is done is to actually bring back domestic manufacturing in the US. So it's a financial/industrial policy. There is a possibility to do a pared down version of this in India, which would go a long way, given its cost advantage and given that it doesn't have really dirt cheap fossil fuels.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me move on to Sushant now. So So Shant, there is, as you can see, a lot of conversation about, how to decarbonize the consumption side of things. But sometimes we feel we forget about the backbone of the economy, which is the supply chains. And so we'd love to hear from you about how you approach green transformation of supply chains and what are the associated business risks that you see from your vantage point.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shruti. And I really feel in a lot of the remarks that have been made by my fellow panelists and also earlier on, it raises a lot of visibility to the complexity of interdependencies, I would say. And just as you point out, when one talks about consumption, it's clearly that it's linked also to supply and capacity issues. And for us coming from the industry in supply chains, as investors in supply chain transformation, we view still a lot of ongoing unpredictability and unevenness. And whether you measure that in terms of how countries have emerged from the pandemic and how uneven that has been, the unevenness in demand, where you have one phenomenon of lots of cutbacks in demand due to inflation and high prices on the one hand, and yet still unprecedented middle-class growth in economies like Nigeria, India, Philippines, and Indonesia. And again, in the aftermath of the pandemic on the production side, that has led to a sort of reshaping of the landscape of production due to reshoring and onshoring and what has sometimes been referred to as a re-globalization as companies and governments seek to create more resilience in their supply chains and minimize disruptions. And the fact is that today there still is an ongoing struggle in supply chains. They may not be at the stress level that they were during the pandemic, but for many customers, the lack of clarity in shipping schedules still in turn creates unpredictability in production cycles. So for us, when it comes to the decarbonization of supply chain, we always say to take a step back and appreciate that complexity and the interdependencies at hand. And more importantly, from that view, recognize the fact that the current ways of business, the current ways of production, our consumption is not going to lead us to a net zero future. I live in Germany, a country which has actually legislated for companies to monitor both human rights as well as environmental risks in their supply chain. And I believe that's indicative of the pull that comes not only from the ambition of companies on their own to reach net zero, but also the pressure that will increasingly come from policymakers as sustainability imperatives are codified into law. But we're very exposed in emerging markets. We're big investors, for example, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Africa. And what's also clear to us is that addressing the sustainability imperative is not straightforward for many businesses. Particularly, I would say, for small and medium enterprises in hard-to-abate sectors like ours, or for businesses with physical assets and complex supply chains. And as we all know, supply chains entail complex systems of trucks, of ships, of aircraft, trains, ports, distribution centers, warehouses, and all of these are nodal points in the movement of goods, which require, in some way or form, tremendous amounts of energy, leading to CO2 emissions. And it's estimated that freight alone puts up to 30% of all transport-related CO2 emissions. So that has been a great impetus for us and my company, Agility, to invest in the transformation of supply chain in 3 levels. To make them faster, in other words, to remove friction points in global trade, to make them more equitable, in other words, more accessible to small and medium enterprises, to women entrepreneurs, to small businesses in emerging markets, and finally, to make them cleaner. And on that front of cleaner supply chains, our approach includes significant investments in parts of those nodal points I mentioned. So really looking, for example, at investments we've made in electrified powertrain systems for heavy duty and long haul trucking. And similarly, we're owners of the world's largest aviation services company, Menzies. And through Menzies, we have committed to the deployment of sustainable aviation fuels to support carbon neutral flying. And it was interesting to hear Dr. Sivaram in the conversation. We know him very well as we are one of the founding members of the First Movers Coalition, which under the Special Envoy Secretary Kerry was launched as a joint effort by the US State Department and the World Economic Forum to have a group of leading companies committed to early market procurement and scaling of technologies that can help address climate change and safeguard the environment. So ultimately, it's the complexities and interdependency that leave us with a lot of respect before the challenge ahead of us. But we know that the approach has to be driven by alliances, by partnerships. It's very hard to do it alone. So that means conversations with customers, with policymakers, with the communities in which we operate, as we feel that in those alliances, with those conversations, we're in a better position to meet our targets.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is very critical, and also the role of the circular economy, right? As you said, we have to reduce consumption, and to reduce consumption in the whole industrial segment, we will have to do more of reuse and recycle within industrial production as well. So thank you for that. So Rudra, I'm coming back to you right now. So, Mark mentioned that it's very hard for businesses to take the lead sometimes because some of it might not make business sense. And that's where the critical role of policy is, to make sure that some emerging technologies have a business model and a real business case. So where do you see, in India, where a lot of policies have come about, besides solar and, wind, targets, we have the National Hydrogen Mission now, we have, some viability gap funding for offshore wind that has been recently announced, and we have the production linked incentive scheme. So where do you see are the specific investment opportunities where you're investing in India? And also, do you see them in the supply chain transformation already, where it's making business sense? Sorry, you're on mute again.
So Shruti, thanks. I'll answer your last question first. Where do you see profitable businesses building out in this space? Some of the, and I'm going to give examples of the companies that I know, some of the companies we've invested in. So, for example, our indoor farming investment is massively profitable because and the buyers are either large sovereign states who need food security coming from a reliable and verified source, or large corporates like McDonald's or Subway who need factory style tomatoes which cut in a certain way, which give out specific amount of juice every time you cut them so they don't soil the bread, etc., etc. Those are brilliant businesses that I see growing very well. Because of the government's policy around electric vehicles and the subvention that the government gives, I think there's a huge impetus around that. But I don't know how sustainable it is for the government to continue to do this. Hopefully, the technology costs as businesses scale and the economies of scale kick in on the manufacturing side, it'll be easier for the government to subvent and slowly make the company self-sustaining. The problem with early innovation, is that it's expensive and it's only adopted by people who are typically wealthy. With India's, lower class, if India does not fix, tier 3 and tier 4 cities the way they live, and I'm not talking about carbon generation from electricity, but just the way food is grown. For example, specific states in India where sugarcane and rice are grown in a massive way and water is wasted. These are very hard reforms to bring about. They're politically very, very challenging for the existing government and for the next government, because they were guaranteed to lose you the next election. So it's very easy to say make the change, but it doesn't happen on the ground. So where does capital come in? Capital has to come in from, and going to your next question around on real capital, how do you see capital coming into India? I don't see India being able to finance herself and her green revolution with her own internal accruals. And for the first time, I think the West has to realize that we had a panel earlier. What was the lady's name? Suriya, who said that the dictatorial. Actually, India will gain the most from the dictatorial governments. We need to make friends with them to get them to invest in us. So, America and India cannot be viewed from the same sort of viewpoint. All the governments that the US has alienated are actually going to be massively, hopefully China too one day, but the others will be massively helpful to India's green revolution. And we cannot possibly alienate them. And all the capital, all the gas we buy, etc., the fact that we can trade in rupees with Russia is huge for us, for oil. It improves our trade balance. It improves our fiscal balance. We are trading in our own currency and encouraging our exporters to export to them. But these are difficult conversations to have in global, conferences, because typically you're like, you're not seeing the world's problem. And I think Minister Jaishankar has said enough about this. But as in diaspora, at least I can say amongst here that I hope the investors in the West and thought leaders in the West realize that we have 1.4 billion mouths to feed, out of which, I think 800 million are severely poor. And when we pollute the air, by burning coal and by burning kerosene, we are polluting your air. When we dirty the ocean through our rivers, we are finally dirtying your ocean. So fix this, clean this, bring some real capital with long-term, payback periods, lower cost of capital. And where the government can really come in handy is where if they start the only place where I think the government can really do something is underwrite the currency risk, because the cost of hedging for me is 4.5% to 5%. So even if I bring a green bond at 2% or 3%, I'm going to spend 8 to 9%. There's no way I can encourage innovation and then add my risk premium around venture capital and early stage investing. It will not happen unless the world sort of cooperates and comes together.
Yes, thank you so much for covering certain financial interventions that we need. I have heard from many different people the currency risk hedging is one key piece of bringing in the required trillions of dollars of scale of investment in India. So thank you for that. So Kiran, I'm coming back to you, but I don't see you on my screen.
I think Kiran had to leave. He just sent a message saying he had to rush.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so Sushant, you're up next then. Sushant, 3/4 of infrastructure that will exist in India in 2050 is yet to be built, right? So how can India do this right? And what kind of policies or other mechanisms are needed to ensure that growth in supply chains is climate friendly?
Yeah, Shruti, I find the question very interesting because we are under, with the theme of our session today, also considering the Atmanirbhar Bharat and how to realize that. And so when I think about this, my spontaneous response is that there has to be the right balance, because one part of the equation is for sure, and I think it's a very sort of noble endeavor, right, to create self-reliance in India, create local markets, local entrepreneurs, local successful enterprises, local innovators, etc., and the skill base that are required for those kinds of jobs that will be needed. Because there will be transitions not only in energy, but there will be transitions in the skill sets, the education systems, etc., to build that infrastructure that one needs by 2050. But it's important, I think, while there's this ambition of self-reliance, that India is at the same time not disengaged in global partnerships and global fora. And a good illustration of that point is the presidency that India holds, or the chairmanship that India holds this year of the G20. And from the beginning, when Indonesia handed over to India, India has been quite explicit about wanting to be a champion for climate change, but also in a way a voice for the global South. And this comes back to many of the points that Rudra and Amol have been making too before, that there's some degree of, let's say, India's manufacturing advantage or cost advantage, but there inevitably still, time is of essence. So transfer of technologies from the West will also be important, and then seeing how they can be scaled, adopted, etc., not only in India, but in also other parts of the so-called global South. So I think it's these two tracks that need to be in balance, about creating the markets and not creating a dependency outside, but also working in, again, global alliances and partnerships as India is doing to ensure that we're connected still to the best ideas, the best thinking, etc. across the globe. And finally, I would say when it comes to policies, there's what we've heard a lot too in previous interventions is that pragmatism, I would say, is important, that's embedded into the policies to ensure that whether you're on the corporate side or the policy side at state government levels, for example, or municipal levels, that we're serious about it, right? And really taking forward all the measures that are required that will facilitate adoptions or that will create the markets. If we just think of solar panels, right? The R&D investments were made by the United States. Germany created a market for it, and China and India have now sort of disrupted the manufacturing and brought the prices down. But it shows that nobody owned the whole piece end to end. So again, that speaks to that importance of the balance between the self-reliance, but also the engagement with global markets and countries.
Got it. Thank you, Sushant. And you rightly speak about the balance and, the policy needs to be balanced. So let me just quickly wrap up with the final question to Amol on policy. So Amol, India has been a success story on renewables, and that's one of the big things that India has to offer to the global south, on how to bring down prices of renewable energy. So how can India repeat this feat in some other sectors?
I mean, that's a $1 trillion question, I would say, not $1 million. But I mean, there was a formula, and the formula was that create a guaranteed demand with a mandate. So renewable purchase obligation basically required the utilities to buy a certain amount of power from renewable sources. At that point, renewables were not competitive, but there was this kind of mandate, although not perfectly implemented. Created at least an entry point for the private sector to come in and go to the bank saying there is a mandate, so we can fund this based on this mandate. There were some early incentives, but it also so there was a mandate aspect of creating first guaranteed demand that created scale. The second aspect was the central government kind of got all the states together to really increase the scale of procurement. So SECI, which is kind of the central government entity which aggregates demand. So they were doing one of the largest procurement contracts for solar and storage. That gave private sector, instead of doing 100 projects of 20 megawatt each, they were doing massive scale projects, and that kind of brought down the price. Once the cost was down or the prices were down, the utilities themselves got interested. Same formulation can be used first to begin with the auto sector. I think this is a massive sector that faces the risk. So, China and California and US have created these kind of requirements on manufacturers to produce certain EVs. That will give some guaranteed scale for, say, massive investments in battery plants. Then you have to have the financial incentives and some kind of procurement, although it doesn't apply to the transport sector just as yet. So apply the same formulation in the steel sector. The challenge is that we don't have too much time. As you said, it took 10 years for the solar, right? The world is moving. US has passed a massive IRA incentives. China has massive mandates, right? And that is one of the reasons we at the Goldman School created a public policy center. I work at a national lab. There are so much resource thrown in the US in designing policy. Not much is happening in India. So this is where the diaspora has to come together. Academics have to come together because we don't have time. So that's why we established a public policy center at Goldman School, which kind of provides a platform to help government of India with smart policy, but also creates a dialogue for private sector, talk to each other and make those investments, because we literally have 5 years left to make some big smart policy and investment decisions.
Thank you. With that, it's a wrap up. I would like to thank all our panelists for their insightful comments and answers. And I would just like to end by saying that India has a long-standing tradition of living in peace and harmony with the environment, right? The Shanti mantra, from the Upanishads said, Shanti Prithvi, Shanti Rapa, Shanti Roshadhaya, Shanti Vanaspataya. So peace be to the earth and to all the plants and animals inhabiting the earth. So with that, I hope India can lead in reimagining how we live and grow on this planet in a planet-friendly way. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
What a lovely prayer, Shruti. I hadn't heard that one before. Thank you for sharing it. Thank you to all the panelists for being here. And as somebody noted, Kiran did have to leave a little while ago. It was a fantastic conversation. We really appreciate all of you taking the time to imagine the possibilities that exist for India in terms of the carrot and stick approach and things to learn from other countries and the new things that we can bring to the table. Thank you all for being here. I'll now request Mayura to come on and lead us into our next segment.
Thank you, Shobha, and thank you to the previous panelists for such a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Hi, everyone. My name is Mayura Sen, and I'm the Senior Director of Collective Careers at Indiaspora. I have the great pleasure today of introducing our next speaker, Jane Burston. Jane is the founder and the Executive Director of the Clean Air Fund, a global philanthropic organization working to create a future where everyone breathes clean air. Prior to starting the Clean Air Fund, Jane was the head of climate and energy science in the UK government. We are thrilled to have Jane join us today to share her thoughts on how philanthropy can drive cross-sectoral change for climate action. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mayura. And I was going to introduce the topic with just a few slides. Initially about who we are, and then I've got three examples of the sorts of things that philanthropy can do to move the dial on air pollution and climate change. So as the slides are just moving on to being shown, the Clean Air Fund is a philanthropic organisation. We're a re-grantor, so the investments come from a range of different philanthropic foundations that have backgrounds in climate, but also that have backgrounds in health and early childhood development. And everybody knows that pollution really hurts people's health. It's one of the leading causes of death globally. About 15% of all deaths worldwide are caused by air pollution. And I guess many people also know that there's a link to climate change. In fact, there's three. First of all, some pollutants hurt people's health and are also directly bad for the climate. And one example of that is black carbon, which is a type of particulate matter. It's soot, essentially. And that's both really bad for people's health, one of the most toxic types of pollution, but also it has a very high global warming potential per ton. It's more than 1,000 times as bad as a ton of carbon dioxide. Secondly, most of the sources of air pollution are also sources of greenhouse gases. And that's because burning fossil fuels produces both. So whether it's transport or industry or other sources of burning fossil fuels, the causes of both are the same. So the solutions can be the same. Things like more public transport, renewable energy, and clean solutions for industry. And then finally, and more on the cons side, air pollution can also often be more accessible to people. So even though the solutions to air pollution and climate change are the same, air pollution is the kind of thing that people grasp a bit better. Everybody understands what the fumes are. You know, in India, a lot of the time the pollution is visible, so people know it's there, and it's more tangible to the average person than greenhouse gases and climate. So sometimes you find that people will grasp air pollution policies better than, or the air pollution rationale for a policy better than they can grasp the climate rationale. So in all of those ways, the two things are linked. And we as a philanthropy are focused on solutions that both help people's health and help climate change, because they're reducing the sources of pollutants that are also sources of greenhouse gases. We spend about $5 million a year in India. Our overall budget globally is about 20 million. And so if you move to the next slide, There's a few different types of things that we and other philanthropies are doing on air quality, and I think it will probably fall into 4 different categories. The first is getting the data and evidence together for change. And that's working with researchers, sometimes with businesses and governments, making sure that the health impacts, the economic impacts are known to everybody, and even pollution levels and what the sources are. Secondly, working with communities and civil societies to make sure that people are aware of pollution and also the sources of it and what they could do, but also that communities and civil society organizations are working with policymakers to make sure that policies are being designed that will be acceptable to people. I know that the previous panel talked a lot about kind of public and therefore political acceptability of different policies and the art of the possible there. So civil society organizations have quite a lot, do quite a lot of work to bring community groups into policymaking. Thirdly, working directly with governments on the technical know-how to implement those policies. And then finally, working with businesses on what they could do voluntarily and what kind of mandatory action might be coming down the line. So for the rest of the talk, I've just got 3 slides with 3 examples of the sorts of projects we've worked on that might spark some questions and thoughts from the audience. And I think we've got time for a couple of questions at the end. So if you move to the next slide. So working with government, in India, the government has a very ambitious national clean air programme. It's 40% reduction in pollutants with a baseline of 2017, 40% reduction by 2026. So a huge ambition there. And as you can see from the map here, a lot of the activity is going to be in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, but the non-attainment cities, which are the ones listed in this programme, are actually all over the country. And there's a few different things that philanthropy can do. I mean, starting off with progress tracking against this ambitious programme. One of the things that the Clean Air Fund has funded, working with the UN Environment Programme and the Central Pollution Control Board, is an overview, a report with the overview of the status and trends of air quality in India and recommendations for the future response. And this then makes progress against implementing that programme transparent. It helps the government keep on top of it. And that report is going to be due out from the UN Environment Programme and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition alongside the Pollution Control Board within the next couple of months. On the data side, there's lots of different ways in which philanthropy can support data collection for policymaking. Something that we're doing with the Delhi government is monitoring real tailpipe emissions of vehicles. You know, it's one thing knowing which vehicles are registered, but obviously vehicles from all over the country can drive into Delhi. It's another thing knowing what the actual tailpipe emissions are, whether or not pollution control certificates are being carried out appropriately, and that will then inform transport policy on how to enforce those rules better. And then on capacity building, one of the things that we hear most frequently from local and state level government and pollution control boards is the lack of capacity for implementing. You know, there's a strong programme, there's budget incentives through the 15th Finance Commission. And there's large loans often. For example, the state of Uttar Pradesh has got a $550 million loan from the World Bank. But oftentimes these things don't fund the capacity to spend the money. And so one of the things, for example, that the Clean Air Fund is doing is funding a project management unit for UP so that they can execute on that loan effectively. Other philanthropies are funding similar units with local and state government to spend different budgets. So on the next slide, the second example is about working with civil society. And there's 2 main aims of this project you can see here that we have with the Mahila Housing Trust. As you might know, when there's peak pollution episodes in Delhi, there's a graded response plan that means that certain industries or sectors will get closed down to reduce the peak pollution. And one of those sectors is the construction sector. Obviously, for the construction workers, if they're not able to work on any given day, then they lose income. And these female construction workers weren't accessing the replacement salary that they are able to access from the government. So one of the things that the project, working with their organizer, the kind of sectoral group, Mahila Housing Trust, was educating them about the potential to access this social security scheme, so that they can do that when the construction sites are closed. And secondly, as a result of the project, in Delhi specifically, the government launched a Doctors on Wheels scheme to give those same workers better access to healthcare. Because in this case, as is often the case around the world, these women who are very exposed through their workplace to sources of air pollution are also the least likely to have access to the healthcare that they need at home. And then the final slide is about a project working with business in India. If you just skip back one, as the previous one hopefully is there. One of the first things that we noticed when we started working in India, right when the Clean Air Forum was born 4 years ago, was the huge number of Indian business leaders that wanted to do something about air pollution. There's already one channel, obviously, through the CSR funding, and a number of businesses have been funding projects on all kinds of things to reduce air pollution, especially around crop residue burning. But we wanted to provide a platform for those businesses to get together and look at scaling up those initiatives, and also talk about what kind of reporting that they might want to do and how they could support the government to meet the objectives of the National Clean Air Programme. So we funded the Confederation of Indian Industry to provide the secretariat for a group, and they launched the India CEO Forum for Clean Air. I think at the time there were 17 members. Now it's more than 100, mostly Indian headquartered and Indian owned businesses. And they've all committed to a range of actions for corporate action on clean air. One of the things that they did, which was pretty interesting, was they worked with the consultancy Dalberg to look into the economic impacts of air pollution on businesses themselves. I think oftentimes we see economic impact numbers and they refer to the cost to the national health system, for example. Nobody's really looked into the productivity impacts for businesses. For example, if people are staying off work because they're sick because of air pollution, or their kids are sick, or they have to retire early because of illnesses that they got due to air pollution. So Dalberg did these calculations using a lot of data that these businesses provided to them, and then some publicly available data. And they found that air pollution costs Indian business $95 billion a year. So there's the huge incentive there for business leaders to do something about it. And through this alliance, then they're promoting this narrative that air pollution costs business as well as costing the health system, and trying to encourage other private sector entities to get involved. And one of the things that they then with CII managed to input into was the government's decision to mandate thermal power plants to ensure that 5% of the fuel was biomass, and that's waste biomass from things like that would have otherwise been burned, crop residue in the main. And so that's really reducing both burning outside and making the thermal power plants more sustainable. So I will close there, but that's a summary of the sorts of things that philanthropy is doing and the way that philanthropic initiatives can bring together lots of different types of entity and sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. I just want to give a big thank you for being here and obviously providing all this insightful information. Guys, are we okay on time for one question?
Go ahead, Sunny.
Jane, I think, first of all, I think, one of the cool things about the Clean Air Fund is that you guys do a lot of research, and a lot of it is data backed in terms of what you guys are finding. And I think one of the most shocking statistics that, you can find on your website, as well as if you look it up, is that, 7 million people die each year from air pollution. 7 million people. That is a staggering number. And it's not even something that it makes, tangible sense to someone who's thinking about just from air pollution, how many people are dying each year. So obviously there are, a lot of barriers to coming to a complete solution. There's rapid urbanization, industrialization, dependence on fossil fuels. What is sort of the first domino that you think needs to fall in India that will then sort of, get the rest of the barriers moving towards a solution?
That is a tricky one. I want to answer everything everywhere all at once. The first domino, building on what the previous panelists were saying about political will, I think I would say maybe I can pick two things. Either a unique policy that has public buy-in and is easily implementable, or the ability for the public to raise their for the public's awareness to be raised about the health impacts of air pollution, and so that the government can see that actually maybe some of the policies that they didn't think there was the will to implement, that there might be. And those will probably be the two things I'd pick.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And I want to advocate everyone to, look at the Clean Air Fund, as well as, any other philanthropic organizations out there that are doing a lot of great environmental work. And again, thank you, Jane, for being here. And with that, I'm going to transfer it over to Neha, who can give us our closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Jane, and apologies to everybody for us going over, but there was just so many great nuggets that we were able to get out of the conversation. And truly, this is something that could go on for days, and we tried to condense it into a short amount of time. So truly, thank you for being with us. And I'm pretty sure that if we were in person, there would be a standing ovation at this point, because we've just learned a tremendous amount from these inspiring speakers, and what an invigorating discussion. So just a virtual thank you to everybody, and thank you truly to everybody who also participated today. We will be concluding our event today with a beautiful musical tribute to the timeless spirit of India's reverence for precious water resources, which was created by Indiaspora's friend, Kanikas Kanakeshwar. Thank you so much.
விண்ணின்று பொய்ப்பின் விரிநீர் வியனுலகத்து உள்நின்று உடற்றும் பசி எடுப்பது கெட்டார்க்குச் சார்வாய் மற்றாங்கே எடுப்பதும் எல்லாம் மழை எடுப்பதும் கெட்டார்க்குச் சார்வாய் மற்றாங்கே எடுப்பதும் எல்லாம் மழை
धीं तत्तानिता धीरन धीरनन धीं तत्तानिता धीरन धीरनन धीरन धीं तत्तरीं तत्तरीं धीरन धीरन धीं तत्तानिता धीरन धीरनन धीं तत्तानिता धीरन धीरनन धीरनदीं तदीं ऋतों तदनदीं धीरनदीं तदीं ऋतों तदनदीं यत्ता गणत्ता जुणुत्ता निमित्ता प्रतिपरिगों तो यत्ता गणत्ता जुणुत्ता निमित्ता प्रतिपरिगों तो धीरनदीं तधीरनदीं तधीरनननदीं धीरनदीं तधीरनदीं तधीरनननदीं धीरनदीं तधीरनदीं तधीरनननदीं धीं तत्तानिता
வானின்றுலகம் வழங்கி வருதலாழ்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று வானின்றுலகம் வழங்கி வருதலால் தான் அமிழ்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று அமிழ்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று அமிழ்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று
सानि पाम मागस सगम पनि सानि पाम मागस सगम पनि सनि पनि नि पम पम गम मगस नि सग सगम गम पम पनि पनि स नि सग सगम गम पम पनि पनि स नि सग सगम गम पम पनि पनि स
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.